Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. So today I thought I'd do something interesting and discuss what I'm reading. So as people who follow me on Instagram know that I am a history nerd and I tend to read a lot of history books, and very occasionally I get time to read for pleasure because most of the time now I read for research for my second book about Indian history, which is The Lords of India Volume 2, which hopefully should be coming out sometime next year. But occasionally, between doing research for the book that I'm writing, I do get the time to indulge in some historical fiction and historical nonfiction on genres and topics and regions that I'm not researching about for my books. On that road, I ran into a very fantastic book called The Wars of the Roses by Dan Jones. So it's the story of the Plantagenet dynasty and how it collapsed, and the Tudor dynasty came into existence and became the most famous and the most spectacular of the dynasties to rule England, and then Great Britain, which was created during this time of the Stuarts, who succeeded the Tudors. So it's a very interesting period of European history, particularly English history, and the Plantagenets kind of created the idea of the Kingdom of England and its relations with its neighbors like Scotland and Ireland and France. And the fall of that dynasty is the topic of discussion in this book, The Wars of the Roses. And the Wars of the Roses, for those who don't know, is a dynastic struggle that happened for about 100 years in the middle of the 15th century in particular. And it tracks the journey of two sides of the Plantagenet dynasty, the Lancastrians and the Yorkists, and how these two sides fought each other and basically ripped England in half, and the machinations that go into it, who comes to the throne, which sides change directions, who gains power, who dies, who gets murdered, what are the plots that take place within the royal circle and without, how different political alliances work. All of this became almost axiomatic in European politics and English history, and of course gave rise to fantastic historical fiction like The White Queen and of course The Tudors, and most spectacularly The Game of Thrones, which is basically a fantasy version of The Wars of the Roses. So obviously anybody who studied English history would have studied The Wars of the Roses because it stands in between two great dynasties, the Plantagenets and the Tudors, and there is no way to not study The War of the Roses. And as a master's graduate in English history from India, I had to study English history as well because it is part of the evolution of the English language. So I did study The Wars of the Roses, but I couldn't remember a thing because I don't think it was taught that well. I knew the Tudors and I knew a lot of the Plantagenets, but again, we focused more on the literary developments like Chaucer and then Shakespeare and all of these great literary figures, but the political climate itself only was touched upon a little bit to bring color to the discussion of the evolution of the language and literature of English, right? So when I started doing research for my current book, The Lords of India, it is in a period concurrent to the Plantagenet dynasty. So the period I'm writing about currently is the Persianate period of India. So roughly from around 1200 CE to about 1700 CE. So about 600 years, 500 years of history, roughly. So slightly extended backwards and slightly extended forwards to touch upon different reasons for the rise of the Persian period and the collapse of the period. And the Plantagenet dynasty basically straddles this period as well, because the Plantagenets really come into their own in the 1180s, and the Tudors rise around the 1580s. And similarly, the Persian period begins in the 1190s with the establishment of a sultanate in Delhi, and then the Delhi Sultanate itself is extinguished in 1526 by Babur. So the Plantagenets kind of straddle that line, and then of course the Mughals and the Tudors are kind of concurrent with the Stuarts as well. So the height of English monarchy meets the height of Indian imperial period and history, right? So it always fascinated me, these two dichotomies. So when I found this book, on the bookshelf, I was like, I have to try it out. I have to maybe give it a try and see how these two different spheres operated. Because again, the Persian sphere that was in India was, of course, very different from the Anglosphere, which is prevalent in England. Even though we call it the Anglosphere, it was very much a French court and a French culture at the top level. All the kings and the queens were related by blood to the French kings and queens in some way, and also sometimes to the Spanish kings and queens, and sometimes to the German kings and queens. So the European political climate was pretty much reflected in the English position. So again, it's very interesting to see how all of these is reflected in a book like this. And The Wars of the Roses by Dan Jones is a really good book to get into it, particularly for people who don't have a great understanding of The Wars of the Roses, because it lays everything out like a really good story. It's kind of got that Game of Thrones vibes because Dan Jones is telling a story. It's not just about providing facts and information and data. It's not shooting dates at you. It's not shooting, figures that would confuse you, although there are a lot of that as well. But because it's provided through a channel of narrative and storytelling and character development, we get to meet the kings and queens and the earls and the lords and the peasants of this period, even if they have confusing French names and the titles. Everything is very French, and it doesn't really, speak to an English-speaking audience from anywhere beyond Europe, particularly in the Indosphere, where these French words are almost impossible to pronounce, because the French don't pronounce half the alphabets that they use, which is so unlike the Indosphere, where we read everything that you write, because that's the point of language. Anyway, so even though there's a disconnect there, I think the book is really good at telling the story of these characters and trying to provide the motivations for their actions and trying to detangle the complicated webs that are traditionally woven about these characters and tend to confuse the reader or a student of history about the machinations, the urges of the people in these situations of why they did what they did. So I think it's a very interesting story, well told, and it's a complicated period in English history and European history as well. And the way Dan Jones manages to tell that story without overwhelming you with a lot of jargon and information that can sometimes weigh a good narrative down, which is a problem that I have had seen with other historical books. Some of them might be discussed in future videos, depends. So Dan Jones tends to not be bogged down by that kind of experience here. So The Wars of the Roses, The Fall of the Plantagenets, and The Rise of the Tudors is an easy recommendation for anybody interested in English history, particularly for a period that is very complicated, very intricately interwoven with the fabric of what the English country is about, what the English people are about, what the English language is all about, and how it developed over its most volatile period into its most prosperous, or so they say, period. Although if you take a closer look, it's not that particularly different from what preceded it. So yeah, so anybody who wants to understand how a dynasty like the Tudors, which has the most tentative connection to the Plantagenet dynasty, how it came to establish such a powerful dynasty that ruled for such a long time and watched over some of the most interesting periods of English history, I think this book gives us a fantastic understanding of that process and the characters and the events that took place. So for me, this book by Dan Jones is an easy recommendation to any reader, and I would give it a 3.8 out of 5 because it's English history. There are still problems in the way it is told because, again, particularly for people outside of the Anglosphere who are not familiar with French pronunciation and French words, this can be a little dense and a little difficult. But again, that's a problem that other people might have when they try to read Sanskrit or Persian names. So I can't really fault the writer on that. But it's a fantastic book. It's an easy recommendation. Anybody interested in history should pick it up and read it because it's just a fantastic read. So, if there are any other books that you would like for me to read and comment on, do let me know, particularly if it's history. I prefer to read pre modern history, so anything before the 1700s is my period. I love anything between 1700 BCE to 1700 CE. That's the period that I operate in. And I'm not particularly limited to any area, region, European, Asian, Mediterranean, Mesopotamian, Chinese, any of these histories I'd be very interested in. I have not delved so far into African or American histories because I think they deserve their own decade of my life. Presently, I'm still in the more complicated, more rich histories when it comes to certain aspects that I find interesting, particularly related to the histories that I've studied and trying to tell through my books. So, yeah, so if there are any recommendations, do let me know. I might just give it a look. Till next time, have a great day, everyone.